Hello, and welcome to the Plant Engineering Webcast, Resiliency in the Age of Disruption, What Manufacturers Should Know, sponsored by Tulip. I'm your moderator, Tyler Wall, and I'm happy to join you today on behalf of Plant Engineering. I'm happy to introduce today's presenters, Russ, Waddell, and Tim Reblitz. Russ joined Tulip as community lead in 2022 after working for AMT, the Association for Manufacturing Technology, since 2007. He most recently managed the MT Connect Institute, a standard development organization for machine-to-machine communication in discrete manufacturing. He previously was an industry economist at AMT and holds a BA in economics from the College of William and Mary. Tim joined Tulip in 2022 as a solutions lead after working for Applied Materials since 2016, where he most recently worked as MES Global Product Manager. He previously worked in business integration and systems operations for ERP applications at Rivana. Tim graduated from Arizona State University with a BS and MS in electrical engineering with a focus on semiconductor device fabrication and characterization. Thank you for joining us today, gentlemen. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Tyler. Hi, Tim. How are you?
Russ, good to see you again.
Good to see you. You think MES is working?
It depends on how you define MES. I think MES may work for some industries, but I think for the most part, there's a lot of shortcomings with traditional MES offerings that you see in the market today.
We do have an axe to grind. We're out to make a statement here. We'll go through today. We're going to go through kind of the critical pains. This is outlining the problem statement. I'm not sure there'll be a huge amount of disagreement here. It'll be useful to qualify things and put some boundaries on it. But I think the problem is pretty well understood across the board. And then we'll talk about what our view is on what needs to happen next, thinking about what it looks like to go from maybe a technology-centric to a human-centric view. And of course, we would be remiss in our duties if we didn't get into the specifics of how someone can actually do that in reality. No conceptual high level stuff here. We're going to get you into brass tacks. Does that work for you?
Yeah, let's get to it.
Good, because we can't change it now.
Late to change slideware. Yep.
So we did a poll before we went live today. This is of registrations, and we found, when asking about the current state of adoption of digital technology, MES and software being included in that, luckily, the shortest responses here of non-existent and very effective. So at the tail ends, we don't have any digital technology, not a huge group there, but also at the other end, not a large group that feels like it's very effective. You think that's reflective of state of technology, state of adoption, or just feelings?
No, I think that's pretty consistent with what I've seen. Again, maybe for some particular industry segments, perhaps there's more maturity than others, but really by and large, there's a lot of manufacturing that happens out there where you have disconnected systems, and maybe it's on paper, maybe it's a combination of Word docs and whatnot. So yeah, these results are not surprising.
Yeah, same here. The poll question here, whether you're happy with the stack, we'll move on and come back to this in a minute. But we really want to talk about the critical pains of frontline operations. So those pains are going to be about what's actually happening on the shop floor and where there's difficulty with traditional management software. So Tim, let's talk about what hurts about MES. This is MES specific in this particular case. So give me some of the pains.
Yeah, so this is the first axe that we're grinding, right? So, here we're just talking about how traditional MES is hard to use. And, part of that is kind of a user experience perspective, right? So sometimes, the user interfaces themselves are clunky, cumbersome, not intuitive at all. A lot of that comes down to, the design of the system. Most of the, say, traditional MES offerings out on the market are, what you'd consider like a monolith or like a top-down design, where frankly they're just trying to be a jack of all trades, and hence ultimately that means they're a master of none. So they do not necessarily do one thing very, very well for a very specific industry. And the reality is manufacturing processes are very diverse, and much more so than a traditional MES system can account for.
How long have you been serving manufacturers with software or working at manufacturing plants with software?
So formally and professionally, a little over 6 years, and my first kind of foray into manufacturing software was actually at Arizona State University, where I basically built a rudimentary MES from scratch. And in doing that, the first thing that came to mind was, well, what needs to work for this particular process for this operation. In this scenario, and that's fundamentally what we'll get into in regards to a human-centric approach. So, and I think that's generally what a lot of people try to do if they're making an MES from scratch. It's it's not necessarily this top-down design approach of let's build something highly configurable, quote unquote. But even those configurable systems might be 60-70% of a fits a requirement. So. It's more so what exactly needs to be built for that particular process and scenario.
Yeah, knowing your process is key, and understanding it and being able to have it documented and clear.
Yep.
So since you're not new at this, let me ask you if this is new. Do you see the expectation of, everything's going to be fully automated robots, and, a robot in every driveway, and every line is
a robot in every kitchen. Yeah.
Yeah.
So again, I think in some, industries, this is, maybe closer to a reality. And in other industries, it's, you just don't really see that, level of automation, either for, practical reasons of material movements and just the ability to automate certain processes. But also, return on investment. Maybe it does not actually make financial sense to, automate a line, that matches this vision and expectation that we have when we consider Industry 4.0 or even 5.0 for that matter.
I think a lot of the conventional wisdom around automation still holds, right? So if you have a low mix, high volume, more automation tends to be cheaper. If you have high mix, low volume, automation tends to be a poor fit. And flexible automation has been the name of the game for longer than I've been working in manufacturing, longer than my whole career, right? That's been the holy grail. And I think I would say that sort of disrespect for or misunderstanding of what's acceptable about, mixed processes. I think part of that is what's causing the fact that we have this expectation from literally decades ago, and we're not seeing that hit the shop floor in everyday reality, right? So the paper processes still exist, the manual processes still exist, and it can be very difficult to understand, particularly if you don't know your process, or if you haven't got your process documented, beyond the four walls of where that process is specifically taking place, or the line where that's taking place. That the reason that things have stabilized on manual paper-based reality is for things like repeatability and reliability and consistency, and risk tolerance of change and those sorts of things. So moving everything to being a robot or everything to be a computer doesn't necessarily solve the problem. The point we kind of want to make here is that understanding, where does the person fit? Why is the person doing this manually? Why is there a paper process? Why is this not a good fit for automation? Or why are individual pieces of this not a good fit for automation? And where is that person being sold short and not getting the opportunity to be augmented with automation, right? So paper by itself is not the enemy, but paper in the absence of a digital substitute, where that digital substitute is superior, that's obviously the thing that everybody's trying to pull out.
Right.
But that gets us to the next point: rigidity. Trying to fit the process.
Yeah, and I kind of touched on this a moment ago when I talked about top-down design. And again, a lot of these traditional MES systems, it's a matter of, hey, here is, this MES system architecture, or say process architecture, that was, sometimes maybe developed in a vacuum, a decade or multiple decades ago. And a lot of times, factories evaluate these systems and say, geez, now I kind of have to fit my process to work into your system, and do I have to change my process just for the sake of getting the system to work? And that's just completely backwards. And how you'd really want a system to work. You want a system that works for your process, and not the other way around.
The integration piece is key, and I would say that a lot of the status quo now is good automation projects that are established and working. The thing that everyone's chasing now, though, is to have that not exist in a silo. So not having silos of automation, and instead having automation that's integrated across the board. Let's go to the survey. Here's what we found. Are you happy with your manufacturing tech stack? All right, let's send these results out to the audience. Looks like not a lot of people are happy and able to scale and adapt quickly. We got partial and no's, right? That's the bulk right in the middle. No big surprises there. But that multiple solutions that don't connect and still having work to do also speaks to the fact that this is really, it's a continuous improvement effort, right? And treating digital projects as if this is a one-time technology installation is missing the point, because you can't have that tech-centric model. You have to have the continuous improvement model, and you have to have the person-centric model. So understanding that the person is not outside of the machines, is not outside of the ERP, is not outside of the supply chain management, that's where you get away from problems with being data rich because you've collected things off the equipment, but information poor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and looking at this tech-centric model, this tends to be something that is, again, I have to say, implemented somewhat in a vacuum. That little person on that slide, is representative of the operator, and rarely is the operator given, a strong voice in, these large implementation projects. These, large implementations tend to take a lot of time and a lot of money, and they're very high risk, and it's just a better way to do that.
Put the operator in the middle.
Yep.
So the data is coming from systems that are familiar, right? For anybody who's been in manufacturing in the modern age, you either know what these things are, you've used them, or you've tried to use them and it hasn't worked out the way you're hoping. And this is traditional MES, and then systems underneath that, so historians, and then traditional, what's now kind of referred to as OT systems to go alongside the IT systems, but it's your manufacturing IT. The headache and the problem is when you're taking sort of capital equipment, sort of, technology development cycles, and you're applying those to the software side of the business and the software side of operations. You end up with things that were put in place as a quick fix, and those become very standardized and long-term fixes instead.
Right.
Talk about that a little for me.
Yeah, it's we're just going to do this as a short-term solution, or this is just a Band-Aid, and that Band-Aid just scabs over, right? And that becomes a permanent part of your structure, and it's obviously not sustainable and not scalable in the long term.
Should we just be assuming that movement and Band-Aids becoming reality is in fact the reality?
Perhaps it's a reality in some factories and some scenarios, but is that the reality that ultimately adds the most value to you? So no.
There's one more thing we have to talk about before we wrap up on what the problem here is, and it's an excruciating piece of this, and it's cost. It's just cost.
Yeah, it's cost and time. Look at the first quote there is, I'm forever waiting for features in the next update. And, think of what that means in traditional MES. You may have, a release every year. And, I, as a customer, am asking for some new enhancement, some new capability in your platform. And, maybe I get that a year from now. Maybe it's 2 years from now, or maybe I never get it. So it just kind of takes a long time, sometimes for these factories to see the value in these very expensive systems. Total cost of ownership. Again, most, MES offerings out in the market there are, an on-premise hardware infrastructure. So there's a lot of servers involved there, a lot of IT FTEs just to keep those running, right? You talked about, data rich. Well, that data needs to get stored somewhere, right? So that's, hard drive costs. So there's just a lot of costs involved in, getting these systems up and running and keeping them running.
So my background is in primarily machine tools and machine shops and data collection, and sort of connectivity at that layer of things. And one of the things that's different between, I would say, like a typical small and medium sized machine shop and a larger enterprise is the lack of, I guess, enterprise software, right? So the not having an MES or something that's equivalent to an MES, or having a homegrown MES based on Excel spreadsheets and databases. Like, this stuff is, the functions may be there in a smaller organization, but we've reached kind of this stasis in the industry where there's an assumption that, well, I'm small and I need to save money so that I can buy the next machine, so that I can buy tooling, so that I can buy, hire a new employee that's going to be a machinist, right? And that the idea that you can go shell out this massive amount of money for an enterprise level management system is it's a non-starter, right? There's not even a conversation about it, and there hasn't been much of a movement down market from the vendor side of things to actually build stuff for. I would say that it's not necessarily the little guys. It's more like the companies that are just not looking for the entire headache of enterprise software buying and enterprise software.
Right.
That whole thing. So my question for you here is, when you talk about the cost. Is the cost, and this is, I would say across the board, right? My question for you is across the board. Is the cost of big software deployments in the MES world, is that coming from the upfront cost? Is it coming from the maintenance cost? Is it coming from the time cost? Like, break it down a little bit more.
All of the above. But yeah, let's talk about, upfront cost. The traditional, let's say, licensing approach has been perpetual licensing, and it would be, again, I mentioned on-prem infrastructure where you have, all these various operating systems and databases installed on, these physical bare metal boxes. And I think a lot of traditional MES companies are reacting to the cost pressures that they get from the customers in a way that says, well, let's, kind of do a lift and shift approach. Okay, maybe it doesn't need to be on-prem, but it's containerized. But, those containers, again, still need to run somewhere. Oh, maybe it's not a perpetual license anymore. It's a subscription base. So I think it's a reaction to those, cost pressures or lower cost expectations that, again, ultimately, like you said, it's a non-starter because these traditional MES software projects, just on a upfront capex perspective, might be on the range of $500,000 to $1 million just to get up and running. But again, once you are up and running, you might have a IT FTE for every 10 servers in some form that are running. A lot of times you have this application that is not, let's say, readily changeable by your process subject matter experts. So now I'm, reliant on this, separate set of resources. So it's a big upfront capex and a big, ongoing OpEx as well.
FTE is a full-time employee. Hiring people to manage your IT. You alluded earlier to a disconnect between people and which people were making the decisions versus which people were using who gets left out of the conversation. Expand on that a little bit, and then I'm going to tell the story, Sophia's story from one of our customers.
Sure. So again, if you think of like these traditional projects, they tend to be, I have, granted my process subject matter experts involved, the IT people and whatnot involved, and you're trying to, essentially do these products in more or less a waterfall approach of what are all the requirements and all the processes and all the capabilities that I need up front. And then, 2 years later, let's do this big bang deployments and get all this stuff, deployed out there, and it's high risk. So everything's got to go correctly. And that's, again, it's high impact, high risk, versus an approach where, you iteratively look at, what is a particular problem that you can solve in a particular place, with, some no code platform that empowers the people, right, to build a solution that actually works for them and works for that process.
It's funny because iteration on problem solving is innate to manufacturing. That's a way that things are solved, resolved, explored, expanded on in manufacturing. And yet, because it tends not to be the way that capital equipment is purchased, and it tends not to be the way that any capital expenditures are made, whether it's software or equipment. There's a tendency and an acceptance of large contracts, very long-term installations, very slow turnaround times on changes, and you end up with sort of it must be big and unwieldy because it's expensive, but it's expensive because it's big and unwieldy, and you have this kind of snake eating its tail situation,
right?
And I think it's going to break, right? That is not going to be the case forever in the future, and that's why I want to tell Sophia's story.
Great, do it.
So she's a continuous improvement engineer, and she came in once Tulip was already in place in the facility, and her day-to-day was basically build an application that would be accessible at individual workstations for providing instructions to and feedback from operators at the equipment. And as she built those things from an initial suite of tools based on meetings and conversations with the rest of the team, each day she would go out, do her little walk around, talk to the operators, talk specifically about, well, how's the app going? And it was quick, it was simple, she would get feedback right away. Hey, I need this thing moved on the screen, or it's cool that I can see this metric, but it would be great if, and all of those, it would be great ifs, all those I would like to have, all the can we tries, all that stuff should go back to the desk in the afternoon, deploy this, build and deploy the stuff that she had heard about in the morning, push it out overnight, and come back the next morning and hear how it went. And so that process of hear the feedback, build the technology to address the feedback, and push an instant change to the user is totally foreign to a manufacturing software buying mindset.
It's unparalleled time to value, really, and it's that's exactly what our platform enables. I love stories like that.
This is so not to toot our own horn too much, but I think the reason that Tulip is interesting and a useful tool here is because the expectations of people who are coming into the engineering core and people who are coming to take over frontline jobs, both sides of that are going to have higher expectations of software, and they're going to have higher expectations of quick turnaround times and the ability to do it themselves. They're expecting that they're expecting that the level of quality of tools in the IT space is going to be at least somewhat close to what they're getting out of sort of the consumer electronics world. And that's going to apply a huge amount of pressure.
And just for a moment, let me just contrast Sophia's story with, what would happen in a traditional MES approach, right? I'm going to submit some enhancement request to my vendor. That goes on a roadmap, and maybe a year and a half from now, I see a service pack with that capability versus, what can Sophia do overnight?
Exactly. Huge difference. But it's not just the technology, it's the people, right? It's that conversation between here's the thing I want the software to do, and then the person who can say, all right, I am capable of putting that thing into the software, and I don't have to be an expert coder.
Power to people. Yep.
Yeah, and it's pushing the ability to make these changes to the place where the decision making exists and where the knowledge exists, and making it so that a decision that is at kind of like at the front line can be managed at the front line, and then that stuff can also feed back to the appropriate supervisory roles. This is why I'm talking about expectations and expecting more. You think people are going to expect more?
I think they should, and I think they can.
All right, let's dig into this more. Who's going to be on the buying committee? Talk about the procurement process. I talked about it in the abstract, but let's get into the details of this.
Yeah, so I think a lot of this, is still pretty familiar as far as, the buying committee process, looks the same, let's say in Tulip versus a traditional MES. And that, of course, leadership is involved because, they got the budget, they have the purse strings, the IT stakeholders and the OT stakeholders. But to me, the most important is like number 4, right? That we see on the bottom left. Those who know your operations the most, these are the people that are, your process subject matter experts that ultimately can be empowered, and build their own solutions, with, minimum dependency on other resource groups like IT.
And that's the group that's most often either left out or the information is poorly captured from that stakeholder group.
Sidelined, ignored or whatnot. Yep. Or the last person I think about. Yep.
Do you see this buying committee model matching? Does this work for small and medium companies as well as big established multinationals?
I mean, at least, small and medium companies, you're going to have more of a scenario where, those process subject matter experts may also be the OT stakeholders and, perhaps, in some leadership role as well. I think in the enterprise space, what would make sense is, not just looking at, hey, let's, decide to use Tulip and, deploy it, across our whole, every site that we have. That's not really our value prop, I'd say. It's more so, where can Tulip make sense in your organization and just organically grow from there.
The pitch we're making, you, me, Tulip, a lot of other software companies that are entering this space and the wider industrial space. The requirements here on in the blue side of the screen, most of that stuff is pretty established. The one that's unique is really the citizen development point. So expand on that a little bit more.
Yeah, citizen development, I almost kind of consider this, or more and more consider this as a philosophy, than just requirements. And part of that philosophy is, entrusting your people, entrusting your, process subject matter experts, your factory managers to, build solutions, again, that work for a particular process, that solve a particular problem, and again, not be dependent on others. But again, a big part of it is just entrustment, entrusting your people to build what is needed.
Yeah, and the tools are getting better to allow that to actually happen. The next point here is to talk about what's augmented lean, right? So we're talking about a human-centric approach. We're talking about citizen development. But the way that this ties back to historical best manufacturing principles is to talk about lean first, and then to talk about augmented lean, meaning all of the lean process improvement things that have, the entire post-World War II history of industrial theory behind how lean is basically the one way to manufacture effectively. And none of that, we don't want to throw any of that out of the window. We think all that's still valid. But the next point, the next phase of that is what happens when there's this huge gap between what computers can do, what good networking can do, and what's actually in the hands of people that are living lean on the front line. So describe augmented lean more, and talk about the augmentation versus supplanting or replacement.
Right. And again, augmented lean doesn't just mean, we have a lean factor and we're just adding an MES. Again, this is, human-centric approach, and human-centric should consider to be an operator-centric. So again, what is the solution that makes, the most sense, that adds the most value, for a particular operator in a particular place? And that's kind of fundamentally the difference that I see. What are the devices, that you need to connect to? Yeah, you're showing the connected, right? So, is there a scale that I can integrate to and automatically collect data and, mitigate some kind of human, error and data entry? I know data-driven is one that's near and dear to your heart, so feel free to expand on that.
So the frustration for me is watching the extent to which the connectivity and data-driven pieces are failing to integrate well in a manufacturing space specifically. And sometimes I look outside of manufacturing to other sort of like business to business spaces, and I feel a little bit better about how manufacturing is doing. But the idea that it is important to understand what's going on with an industrial asset or with a cell or a line level, understanding at a line level or a cell level what's going on there. The maturity of am I going to connect to an individual sensor? Am I going to connect to a controller? Am I going to connect to something that's completely separate and discrete and layered on top of the system as I built it? Am I going to build connectivity in at the base layer? Am I going to use standards? Am I going to use a one-off? Is this going to have to integrate with other lines, or is this going to integrate at a higher level when we're by the time the data is already warehoused? All that stuff is not unique to manufacturing, and it all drives from this data-driven approach. So if you're taking a data-driven approach, I think this is a place where things have gone well. And manufacturing, because of its history, think about SPC, right? That's like the Bible of how manufacturing can be done effectively. So this idea of being data-driven is innate to manufacturing, but the gaps in connectivity wreck pieces of the data-driven approach. And then the augmentation of bad connectivity comes when you talk about adding the human to that piece of it. It's the connectivity is there because the human can only make good decisions if they have the data that they need, and the data is only going to be there if the connectivity is there. So having all of these pieces kind of shuffling forward together at the same time is what's important, and this is what takes us from historic lean in industry 3.0 to industry 4.0 and beyond, and to the augmented version of all of this. So I think that the approach is not like, this isn't hokey stuff. This is I think feels genuine to most people that are trying to engage with a software buying process, and they understand this intuitively, but getting into what that actually means specifically and what kind of a time frame you have to take is the part where things start to get a little bit more difficult. And I also think that it can be challenging when you're head down in a manufacturing environment day to day. It's hard to understand that the rest of the industry is feeling the same pains, right? They're going through the same suffering and misery and agony of data munging and lack of contextualization and poor connectivity. And I think that the thing that can kind of break a little bit of that loose is, let's return to our roots. Let's talk about continuous improvement, and let's talk about where do you put the person into all of that, right? So that's why we keep harping on human centricity as a key piece. Was that enough of a soapbox? Was that what you wanted me to say?
I think so.
Awesome. Let's dig into it. We have an example factory here, right? All right. So this is going to go through our 4 pillars. I'm going to start it, right? So we're trying to go from the people and machines up to systems. So think about this as there's side-to-side connections between departments, and there's also up and down connections. That's, basically from device to higher levels in the system, up to kind of like your enterprise management. So each of the departments has, certainly what we would call point solutions or point use cases where they're of importance. So that's going to be like your pack and ship function, your guided assembly, meaning this is work instructions at a station for putting a part together or putting an assembly together. There's process audits, which means that's kind of the quality department comes in or installs something that's overhead that's checking, is this going according to plan? And then, in the material management and the inventory control side of things, each of these things can separately have technology deployed, meaning software and software tooling to manage each of these processes, right? And tell me about how this would work in your traditional experience and what you've seen in place before.
Oh, and traditional MES. I mean,
yeah, give me the old version.
So old version would be, I have a quality management module, I have a warehouse management, inventory management module, and a packing module, and assembly module. But again, this is a jack of all trades designed product, right? So I'm going to kind of survey everything I know about, let's say, the factories that we know about, and let's build a warehouse management module that we're pretty certain is going to, work for every warehouse out there, or every pack and ship, plants out there, or every assembly line out there. And the reality is that's just not the case. And like I said, even these, let's say, highly configurable, out of the box, monolith MES offerings, maybe fit 70% of your requirements, right? And then there's that gap. That are you just going to live with that gap, or are you going to change your process to work around that gap? So,
well, and this one, I wouldn't, maybe amusing is the wrong word, but there's an interesting observation here, because you immediately jump to, it's going to be modules. Okay, so so great, we're going to buy MES. MES can solve the whole factory. Well, sure, but then then it's modularized, and these modules, maybe that's a module built by the MES vendor. Maybe that's a module that's part of an acquisition. Maybe that's a module that's provided by a third party.
Right.
All of a sudden, it doesn't look like an integrated system anymore, does it?
Exactly. How well do these various modules actually integrate to each other? Yep.
And that's where this disconnect between indiscrete manufacturing and small medium machine shop land, we're not like the big guys, we can't afford the big software. There's actually less of a gap there than it might look like, because if you're a machine shop and you're having really struggling with inventory control, and you do a one-off initiative to get an inventory control system or software, you're going to make that one-time purchase. That's going to be inventory control. You're going to buy the inventory control suite as a unitasker, and that's going to go sit there in a vacuum as I talked about silos of automation, silos of software, right? Like, and that's what sits in the floor when you're looking at it from a separate point of view. Tell me the better way. What's the better way, Tim? This was a softball. All my hard questions, I think I'm done with it.
Okay, good. It's all downhill from here. Yeah, the better way again is rather than saying, hey, I can use this out of the box, warehouse management system. How does warehousing actually work at your facility, and what actually makes sense? Maybe you don't have racks, and maybe you don't have pallets, and your storage of your material is completely different from anything that you've seen in any system. So that's where that's what the difference is actually a bottoms up organic built solution for your very specific particular need.
Yeah, and in Tulip we have users, and this is part of what your job is helping users either deploy library apps that already exist, that can help out of the box with the pack and ship function, with the guided assembly, with the process audit. So you're taking templates and examples that are most of the way there, and then tailoring those to the specific facility, or it's building from scratch, in a drag and drop PowerPoint style app building function, and you're taking the people who know the process, and they're basically mapping it and then building it, and then building the visibility and improvement tools on the Tulip platform there. The infrastructure side of things, and why it matters to kind of have platform here, is when you're looking at adding context. We skipped a little bit over the contextualization of that data and what contextualization means. I feel like sometimes this is a fancy word for a thing that's intuitively obvious, but understanding the context just means, what does that data mean at the place where the data was created, and what does it mean when comparing it against sort of the neighbors of that data? So under the context here would be, if you have these silos in each of the departments, failing to contextualize that means you built a silo, you built table logic, you built the table structure, and none of that stuff applies outside of any of those individual departments. So there's two sides of it that are a problem. One is there's structural gaps where you actually can't integrate the data easily with the other pieces of the data. And that's true whether you have modularized MES or whether you have individual solutions or whether you're building out a Tulip suite. It's true across the board that you have to consider that sort of integration. The other piece of it is knowing that somebody else down the line is going to consume this. So if you have a team of data scientists, or if you have a manager, or if you have, even if you want to push this information back to operators, understanding that a thing happened in assembly because there was an issue in inventory or in materials or in, whatever other department where this stuff exists, not breaking the meaning that exists only because these data are carried together. That's the contextualization piece. And having something where the architecture is considered or nudged towards for you, rather than having to consider this every single time you start to build software. That's one of the things that I think ties both the plant people in knots and the software people in knots, because the plant people aren't used to doing it, and the software people are used to doing it in a software way that completely ignores what's actually happening in the data. I like the contextualization conversation. I stole that one from you. Sorry. The analysis side. Tell me about the analysis side. I'll let you take this one. This is more of what do we do with the data once we have it? Sure.
Yeah, and again, it's a matter of like, okay, we're not just capturing data for the sake of capturing it, but what can I actually do from this? What are the insights that I can get value out of? It could be something as basic as a Pareto chart, of which we see a couple examples on screen there. It could be a matter of like doing some automated corrective actions of this event's happened, so go notify this person, or go send this notification, that kind of thing. It can be showing in front of the operator something that is motivating of hey, here's your actual performance that you are doing today based on what your target is, what your goal is versus what you did last week. So it can be very personalized as far as the data that you show in front of an operator.
And personalizing it to what's going on at a station, or in the context of where an individual, one worker, one operator, or one engineer, where they're working, is also helpful. And being able to do that where you have, central data store. Some pieces are for some people, some pieces are for other people, but also the ability to say, hey, well, I'm missing this one piece of data. And based on, we have a talk about this is what's going wrong here, or this is what's going well here, and we want to apply somewhere else. And if it becomes clear that, well, it would be great if we only had this other piece of data to tell us about that. Now we're back to the whole mindset and rapid deployment problem, where if it's going to take you 3 months to get another piece of data displayed on your dashboard, you've lost all the momentum and inertia of trying to make that improvement at the decision maker. So that's where the person comes into the middle. It's the same thing over and over again. We're just repeating ourselves in different, better words with slightly better levels of detail. You want to get go into some real examples of what to do?
Yeah, let's get to it, and I think then we'll have plenty of time for questions.
Yeah, here's the steps. Start with these steps. This is I love this chart, but I want you to talk about it.
Yeah, this chart, when I look at it, it's fundamentally a return on investment type of messaging, right? So what has high impact with little effort, right? So hence the low hanging fruit. Boom, that's job one, right? What also has impact, but maybe less so, and also low effort, then great, that's your second priority. Then you see, if this is like a really high impact and a lot of effort up in that top right, is this something really even worth doing, right? This is high risk, high impact, can we just kind of, put this on the back burner? And then, bottom right there, you see, hey, what has, some impact and it's going to take a little bit longer to implement, fine. But yeah, obviously, like, your priority one, priority two should be fairly obvious. So,
and this is something that the procurement team that we talked about earlier, whether you have a 4-person team, or whether you have a 10-person team, or whether you have multiple departments, or whether you have, the head engineer and the owner. This is the thing where you can actually write this stuff down, right? Like, you can classify as you're going through the vendor selection process and talk about in your business, what's the low hanging fruit, what's the proceed with caution, and what's in between. And you will be better equipped to go to a vendor and have a smart conversation with them, because you know your process better than they do. They will have a view of your process that's different than your view. So when you tell them about your process, they may have insights that you wouldn't have otherwise had. But if you go into it fully cold, then you'll be missing out on your own knowledge of the process. If you go into it overly rigid, you'll be missing out on the insights that the vendor may bring, and have an ability to communicate this stuff, preferably in writing, because then you can involve everybody, and like actually classify it. It's surprising how very simple advice like this, how far that can take you.
And you know what, proving the ability to solve some of this low hanging fruit, that's something that you can do in Tulip with a trial, right? Versus again, to harp on traditional MES again, like you said, it's a non-starter. It's hey buyers, can I spend $1 million for something that'll be implemented a couple of years from now that might solve our problem that fits most of our requirements? Versus hey, we use this platform, we put together something that's valuable and useful to us within a couple of months. That's a stronger message.
And if you're coming from software development, which most manufacturers are not, this is an obvious shift that has taken place a long time ago. And it's happening now in manufacturing as this long-term, it's monolithic systems, and it's also a monolithic deployment approach. So these crazy long timelines where everything is waterfall, one thing after another after another. The way that the thing that's missing is thinking about that in terms of risk, right? There's not the thought around how that long timeline, it feels comfortable and it feels like it's the safer way to do it because we're taking our time and thinking it through. But in reality, that's imparting all kinds of risk around the inability to adjust quickly, the over reliance on the things that you've already decided. So if you decided 6 months ago, this is what the solution is going to be, and now you get to 5.5 months and it turns out we made a pretty big mistake at the beginning. Well,
Or not only that, maybe it wasn't a mistake, but now the requirements have changed. The business has changed, our manufacturing processes change. And, up on the top there, you see, the old way maybe takes 12 months, 18 months. 18 months later, did what you talk about 18 months ago, is that still valid? Is that still relevant? And commonly, maybe not, right?
Make the little block, show the value across the board from top to bottom, show something that's actually going to work, in a 1 to 1.5 month time frame. And then you'll build more things that can individually be piloted. And you can also work on the infrastructure that lays underneath those individual use cases. So thinking about that overhead view of the plant, build one of those departments or build something that's minimal across all the departments. Either one works. And then the integration step is an ongoing process. You're never going to be done with the maintenance and management for that connectivity and maintaining the commonality of the data model and the microservices piece of that. Yeah. So this is the way the future is going. I don't think this is Tulip is popularizing this, but I don't think it's a Tulip exclusive worldview.
But even to look at the Tulip worldview, in this context, let's say the iterative approach is not just we're going to start with all of assembly. It could be we're going to start with assembly for this one cell or this one subassembly cell, see how that goes, and propagate from there. So it can be a very granular approach.
And the lessons learned become the foundation on each of those point solutions, basically. So you have the lessons learned, and you're able to move forward quickly. Yep. Here's a couple examples, real world examples. Do you know about these guys?
Yeah, I do not. I unfortunately have only been with Tulip, less than you, let's say. So I'll let you speak to these.
Let me enlighten you.
Please do.
So Piaggio, these guys are the scooter makers. They had a brand new product. This was like never before seen in the world from Piaggio or anybody else. They had a prototype already, but they wanted to scale up to production. And so this was a case where the product wasn't exactly greenfield. The process was closer to greenfield, and they had manufacturing knowledge that was brought from the parent company. But the Fast Forward business unit was trying to do things, faster, leaner, better, cleaner. And so, they kind of started with a mobile first approach and a worker first approach where everything was going to be close at hand through this whole assembly process. And what the result here was that they were able to take the instructions and the directions on how this assembly for the brand new product was going to go, and that was feeding into iterative improvements on the process itself, so that the guidance was not just serving as guidance. The guidance was also serving as data collection and conversation, like the basis for the conversation on how is production going. And so they never really got into a legacy mode. They were always in that agile, rapid process improvement. And that's sort of an ideal implementation of this idea of continuous improvement in a physical space, but what does the software do, and what does the software have to do to be able to actually solve that in when it's software interacting with a physical space? That's Piaggio fast forward. The outcome here was that they did a second line. So they started with one line, business moved up, and then they carried the whole thing onto a second line.
Awesome.
These guys are cool too. They do dental implants. So this was a process that's lot sizes of one. And on the fulfillment side of things, there is basically a kit that is shipped out to each customer. So the customer is ultimately you or me getting a dental implant. And then also it's the pieces that go with that dental implant go in a little box and then goes to the dentist. So basically the dentist or the oral surgeon is the customer. And every one of these is going to be the same. And one of the problems they were facing was oral surgeon would say, hey, I'm missing screw X, Y, or Z. You guys didn't ship it to me. So what was initially set up as a guided work instructions on a screen at an assembly station, at a kitting station, that started as guidance and instructions. But because there was like an overhead camera on the system showing what was going into the box, there was like a tag of each item that had been scanned and put in the box. Then there was a photo of what was in the box, and that was all associated with every single fulfilled order. Right. So we cut the training time by 6 months and dramatically decreased the defects. 60% decrease in defects, and then the visibility side of things, and like this is still kind of just scratching the surface of what can be done, and that was a great first use case. We're running out of time. Let me wrap it up. Let me make you wrap it up.
All right. So first message here, it's a journey, right? So one thing that you've heard us consistently say is, iterative approach, organic emergence, that kind of thing. So, don't think of having to implement us as this, big bang, high impact, high risk project at all. No, let's start with something that is a pain. Start with a problem that can be solved in a couple of months, in a few months for some particular area, for some particular process. Great. And again, the solutions that we'll put together, again, is all about human at the center. So not just, building a monolith on a new platform, but more so, building something that is very intuitive to an operator, intuitive ideally to the point that, a new operator should be able to use the software and see that it's actually of value to them, and not just something that is thrust upon them that they have to use, but it's actually something that adds value to them and that they can, use pretty easily with minimal to no training.
All right, so let's get started with the Q&A here. The first question on the list is, would a solution like Tulip replace our current system, or does it integrate to improve what we are currently using?
Yeah, so I'll take that. If your current system is just paper, right, then obviously that's a great candidate for replacing paper and various Word docs and Excel spreadsheets with a modern digital system. Even if you are using a modern MES, that is something that certainly we can integrate with. So you can consider what is a gap in your current system that we can solve together. So certainly we can integrate with an existing system. We can replace an existing system, but I'd say start out with where do you not have a digital solution today?
Excellent. The next question here on the list is, how do I convince my managers that the cost of implementing this technology is worth it?
Russ started to steal the thunder. I'll take that one too.
Go for it.
Again, so if you think of like the traditional MES buying approach, commonly the best you get from a vendor is maybe a tailored demo, for some particular process that you have, versus what you can do with us at least is starting small. Of geez, I think we haven't even have like a free 30-day trial online, but I'll say like a lot of customers come to us and they're just trying to prove out the value and say like, hey, I'm just kind of kicking the tires. I want to, play with Tulip a little bit and then see how that goes and then expand from there. So, just considering like your traditional MES buying cycle is, hey, here's this high dollar amount for this high impact long-term project versus, a smaller dollar ask for, let me, try this out, see that it's valuable, and then we can expand from there.
I have a more specific answer because I see two different groups of people that come asking like, how do I get buy-in? So there's the one group is basically management is bought into a solution in principle. This is the executive who saw a presentation about Industry 4.0 or read an article in plant engineering, and they said, "We're going to do this. We're going to digitize," or it's a corporate wide initiative, right? So in those cases, there's already buy-in. It's more a matter of how are you quantifying and how are you showing the like a trade study of which solutions are going to work, and how are you going to match the entire panoply of every piece of software on earth against what is actually going to do something for us in the digital space in our plants and factories now. So if you already have buy-in there, then a lot of this is a classification exercise and a comparison exercise. And it just comes down to getting the closest quantification you can and talking in terms of explicit numbers. The other group that's looking for the same thing is basically where you have, I wouldn't necessarily say it's a renegade, but it's more of a bottom-up situation where an individual engineer or a team has identified one or multiple vendors or solutions that they think are going to make a big impact or a problem space. So a lot of times we have companies that find Tulip because they're looking for digital work instructions, and they kind of end up with Tulip in the mix. Well, in that case, right, like where you've identified that Tulip is great because it can give you digital work instructions, but you also like the flexibility of build your own apps, and you also like the connectivity side. Don't get carried away with all of the things that it can do. Worry about what are the things that it's going to do today, what it's going to cost now, what it's going to cost in maintenance terms, what it's going to impact in terms of the full-time employees that you're talking about, where like think about the connections to the other pieces of the business and who it's going to impact immediately. Because there's a tendency when looking at buying, particularly I would say from an engineer's perspective, is this is going to solve my problem in this thing or that thing. And sometimes that, particularly, if you haven't gone through this process a bunch of times before, there's a tendency to not come to the conversation with management already thinking about what the impacts around the rest of the organization are. If you've done some investigation around the rest of the business, that makes the convincing and the process easier with management. And if you're not exactly sure how to do that, or if you don't feel like that's going to go over well, or if that's like, just not in your wheelhouse, talk to management about, hey, I found this thing I like. I think we should use it to solve these problems. But also, I want to figure out what impact this is going to have elsewhere. Who should I be talking to also about this, and what it's going to help? What are you going to need to help you make the decision about how to go forward on this? And after that, like it's pitching on iteration and continuous improvement. There's no manager in manufacturing who doesn't want to hear about iterative improvement and continuous improvement.
Yep.
Yeah, and that kind of leads pretty well into our next question a little bit. You're kind of hinting at it earlier. What does a Tulip project generally look like?
Yeah, so Tulip projects, generally, here's what I'd say is, Tulip is, again, a human-centric, citizen-developed, empowering platform. So let's say at the end of the project, we want you to be empowered to build solutions on your own without our direct involvement. We have a lot of self-serve resources that are fantastic. Like we have the Tulip University, which is a lot of video-based trainings, and honestly, great trainings. A lot of, let's say, enterprise software, say training documentation is pretty mediocre, but Tulip University is pretty solid. We have the Tulip community, where you have customers basically solving each other's problems, in addition to Tulip people, answering questions. What else? The Tulip library, which has like a lot of kind of canned apps and whatnot. So this is all to say that there's these self-serve resources that you can continually have available to you. But over the course of the project, a lot of it is, just kind of building, the first few apps, the first few solutions together. And again, at the end of the project, the intent and the idea is that you are able to take those apps, iterate them, multiple times. And again, one thing that I've been telling my customers is, think of like, what is the minimum viable product that we can get out on the shop floor to get some value out of? And I also say there's no such thing as like a last version of software. Software is always iterative. Another kind of simile that I like to tell people is, look at like just about any app on your smartphone, and it's at like version 200 something, right? So that's really the modern reality of software nowadays. So don't be worried about the idea of like, oh, I got to get all of this functionality and all this capability out, the first time I install it. No, that's not really needed for our platform.
Cool. And then the next question here is there any downtime when implementing a platform like Tulip?
So the first thing I'd say is, all of our apps run in, what we call the Tulip player, right? And the Tulip player runs on Windows or Mac, Android, and very recently iOS. Once you have an app that you publish, so you can publish an app to like a new version in our app builder. Whenever that app is published, that is the new version that the operators would use the next time they restart that app. So there's very minimal like downtime in that, again, traditional classic software sense. There's no code roll and like, hey, everybody log out of the system for a few hours or anything like that. No, I can make some minor adjustment to an app, publish a new version, and then like, hey, next time you use the app, you're using the new version.
Another question here is, where do manufacturers typically find the most value starting off?
Oh, I have the answer for this one. It's a competition, right? It's just to who can answer more. The most value getting started is coming from people who've already. This is back to it's a process owner who knows the process well and is able to identify or has already down selected to some degree. Here are the things that I need to improve, but is not so far down the path that they've just they're fully committed to this is the only way to solve the problem. So it's coming to a well-bounded, well-defined, well-understood problem with a pretty open mentality about the solution side of it, right? And that's important when buying any software, but it's particularly important if you know that there's going to be the ability to expand, which Tulip is bringing kind of across the board. So coming to it and saying like, we have this area that we could improve, but we know that we want to be, we want to continue on like a wider digital or digitization journey. That's the place where starting with a minimum viable product where you're actually showing value as quickly as possible, so that you understand what's it actually like to go to develop your own software, develop your own apps, or what's it like to have to maintain that stuff. Who's going to care about this? Who's going to be the core user? Knowing all of those pieces and coming to it with an open mind and having done your homework is the best place to start from. Sorry for the conceptual answer, but I think it's important.
No, that's all good. All right, well, this will end the Q&A section. Thanks for the great questions, and thanks again to our great speakers, Russ Waddell and Tim Reblitz, for sharing their time and expertise. And I'd also like to extend a special thanks to our sponsor, Tulip, for sponsoring today's event. Thank you, and goodbye.